InvestorIdeas.com podcast.
Hello and happy 420. Welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcasts. In today's podcast, I'm going to be going over a few public company announcements, retail cannabis in Ontario, as well as UberEats in BC, and lastly, I'll be talking a little bit about today, which is 420. So first, starting with Fire and Flower Holdings Corporation, trading on the TSX as FAF and the OTCQX as FFLWF, who announced advancements in the relationship between the company's strategic partner, Alimentation Couche-Tard, and Fire and Flower through the completion of a master license agreement with MC Cannabis Incorporated, which is an indirect wholly owned subsidiary of Couche-Tard. Now, with the signing of this agreement, we have achieved another important step forward with our strategic partner, Couche-Tard. We continue to work closely together to build a sustainable growth engine, leveraging Couche-Tard's high-quality real estate assets, retail operations, expertise, and capital, accelerating our path to profitability and the goal of free cash flow, shared Stephanie Trudel, the Chief Executive Officer of Fire and Flower. Now, successful retail is built on the delighting of customers with great locations, people, and products. Now, today we've expanded our ability to grow the Fire and Flower network in Canada and other international legal cannabis markets by adding this scalable building block that we can further refine together in the first federally legal cannabis market in the world. Couche-Tard is pleased to have entered into this master license agreement with Fire and Flower. The Hi-Fire digital retail platform, including the Sparks Perks membership program and the Spark Marketplace app, will bring a distinct competitive advantage to our cannabis stores. And the current co-located cannabis stores adjacent to Circle K locations and anchored by convenience stores, fuel and car wash offerings are showing growth, and we look forward to combining this with the recognized Fire and Flower brand and technology-enabled shopping experience to make it easier for customers, shared Steve Pitts, the Vice President of Operations for Central Canada of Couche-Tard. Now, as far as some of the details of the master licensing agreement, Fire and Flower will now have the exclusive right of first opportunity to negotiate with Couche-Tard with respect to entering new retail cannabis businesses and franchise arrangements in Canada, as well as potential retail expansion to additional legal cannabis markets outside of Canada. And Couche-Tard has exclusively committed to developing Fire and Flower branded retail cannabis stores in Ontario under this master licensing agreement, and the first 5 Fire and Flower branded retail cannabis stores will be recently opened co-located stores adjacent to Circle K convenience stores in the Greater Toronto area that are currently operating as MC Cannabis Incorporated and will be rebranded to Fire and Flower. Now, other benefits include leveraging Couche-Tard's real estate footprint and resources to develop licensing stores. This gives Fire and Flower the opportunity to expand its system sales brand presence with the Hi-Fire digital retail platform in Canada, and through the exclusive right of first opportunity to participate alongside Couche-Tard in a potential expansion to additional legal cannabis markets outside of Canada. And this also expands the reach of the Sparks Perks membership program and Industry's First Sparks Marketplace app. So, for Fire and Flower Holdings Corporation, obviously a good strategic partnership for them, working with Couche-Tard, who again has kind of done well when it comes to real estate acquisitions within the cannabis space. Fire and Flower I've talked a lot about in the past, and we have a lot of good interviews with some of their different executives. And really, as a company, I've talked a lot about the fact that as far as a retail platform, they're doing quite good, but really what separated them from a lot of the other Canadian retailers is the fact that they've focused heavily on technology and have utilized it well. Again, their Sparks program and the Hi-Fire program have probably been the most successful sort of app developments and membership programs that exist within the Canadian market. There are close rivals that are still quite decent, but they've again been the sort of most successful and most consistent. And I do think that this will be a good step forward for them. It is also showing that when you're looking at retail, at least in Canada, there's different considerations that are now being taken into a look at. Basically, you're starting to see that it's not just about, opening retail locations in any part of the province or in any city. They're starting to be a lot more strategic. They're starting to make sure that these are going to be really high traffic areas and are going to be connected to other businesses that make sense for the industry. So again, for Fire and Flower, this is a good deal. For Couche-Tard, this is a good deal. And I do think that this will allow Fire and Flower to continue to expand. Hopefully, eventually, you'll start to see them move a little bit more into the U.S. market and into other international markets. But as I talked about in the last podcast, with what's going on in Germany right now, sort of backpedaling a little bit on some of their cannabis legislation, it doesn't look like Europe is going to really open up in any significant way in the next year or so. So I think that for a lot of these companies that were looking at international expansion into the EU and other parts of the world, they're definitely going to have to be waiting on that. Because again, it doesn't look like the cannabis legalization effort is doing so well internationally. There's a lot of push in the U.S. right now. There's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to try to push for some sort of federal reform or federal decriminalization right now. That seems to be the main path everyone's trying to push for, is at least for the decriminalization method. Doesn't look like anything's actually going to get approved. There is bipartisan support, but there has been for a long time, and unfortunately we always see that things never really pass through the Senate, which is what I would expect to continue to be the case, but you never know. There could be some sort of positive news over the next year or so, potentially as things get closer towards the election cycle in the U.S. You could see more of a development on this. Hopefully this is somewhat of an election issue in the next U.S. federal election. I don't think it will be. I don't think that the Republican candidates, whoever that ends up being, is going to be guaranteed to be in support of cannabis decriminalization or legalization in some fashion. But that's kind of the most hopeful scenario when you're looking at changes in the U.S., is that at least one of the parties does decide to pick this up as a big issue in the next election cycle, and then that could see some proper movement, because that seems to be the only thing that would add enough pressure to actually get this pushed through. But the problem with that then is you would lose some of the bipartisan support. So I don't know if it's ever really going to change, or what's going to need to be done to actually create meaningful change within the U.S. federal system. But for now, like I said, for companies like a Fire and Flower and a lot of these internationally focused retail outlets, building up their systems within the markets they're in and expanding state by state is still an option. It just doesn't allow them as much access, and I think for Fire and Flower, like I said, at least partnering with Couche-Tard will give them a little bit more access when more markets are available. Looking next at Curaleaf Holdings Incorporated, who announced that as of this Monday, April 17th, the board of the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory, the CRC, reversed itself and voted to approve Curaleaf's adult use cannabis licenses. If you'd been paying attention to the news last week, that was kind of a big hit for Curaleaf. I believe it was last week during Wednesday or Thursday. So the CRC board's decision came after the first voting to vacate their decision, so from Thursday last week, when they attempted to deny Curaleaf's adult use license renewals. Now, Curaleaf CEO Matt Darren said today's decision at the CRC board to vacate their unprecedented action last week is an incredible victory for our 500 New Jersey team members and a vindication for what we knew all along. Curaleaf is in good standing with the CRC and has fulfilled every requirement necessary for the renewal of our licenses, and I'm incredibly proud and grateful to every one of the hundreds of dedicated team members who showed up today, not just for their jobs and livelihoods, but for the better, safer cannabis industry in New Jersey. In previously attempting not to renew Curaleaf's adult use license, the CRC board had disregarded the Commission's staff recommendation to renew Curaleaf's adult licenses and the fact that the company has no pending violations. And as part of the approval, Curaleaf will be providing the Commission with additional information regarding its labor practices and confirm its ongoing compliance with New Jersey law. Curaleaf Chairman Boris Jordan said, "This decision by the board is a victory for Curaleaf, a company that has proudly generated tens of millions of tax dollars for the state, invested upwards of $75 million more to support its cannabis industry, and supplied cannabis products to nearly all of New Jersey's licensed dispensaries, including social equity license holders. Curaleaf remains open for business and will continue working collaboratively with the CRC board and its staff to ensure our good standing in the state of New Jersey." So, as I said, if you're paying attention to the news last week, that was a bit of a hit for Curaleaf. Obviously, this puts them back in good standings in New Jersey, so they can kind of continue their expansion plans. And it does kind of show that even now, as there are legal markets and as you're seeing more and more states adopt some sort of either medical or recreational system, most are slowly heading towards a recreational market. We are still seeing that there are difficulties even within legal markets when it comes to cannabis regulatory commissions, when it comes to local legislators, when it comes to mayors, when it comes to city councilors, when it comes to specific neighborhoods. There still are a ton of difficulties that these businesses have to face in navigating these areas, and these decisions that end up happening that impact the industry aren't always based off of some sort of well-founded arguments. Unfortunately, what we see a lot of the time is a lot of people can kind of use the fact that cannabis is so heavily regulated and the fact that there are so many sort of gray areas when it comes to understanding how to properly legislate and regulate the industry, that occasionally you'll see these types of decisions where, again, the CRC made a decision that it didn't really have any necessary reason to make, and then, of course, because of the public backlash and pressure, they ended up reversing it. But these types of things are still impacting the industry as a whole. This is what's really holding back a lot of these companies from developing at the scale that I think a lot of them could be capable of developing at, is they still have to jump through all of these legal hoops basically over and over again. And that even as they are successful and compliant and don't really cause any issues, they can still have licensing issues just suddenly show up because of change in a few members of, like I said, a regulatory commission or a city council or something like that, because of rival cannabis companies investing in the same area and just changing the playing field. But a lot of these issues continue, like I said, to be quite an aggressive problem when you're looking at U.S. cannabis companies. Yes, there's still a lot of very successful cannabis companies. Even Curaleaf is doing quite well in most of the markets they're in. But that being said, like I said, every time there's one of these issues that kind of pulls the legs out from one of these companies, it does remind us that this is what's causing a lot of the instability in the market, and this is what's causing a lot of the skepticism still around the cannabis industry, is the fact that, yes, even though these businesses are legal, even though some of these MSOs are massive companies with a huge amount of staff, with they have actually managed to acquire enough capital, they are being, revenue generating positive, they're doing everything they need to do, there's still a lot of these arbitrary things that could happen to them to kind of, again, pull the legs out of some of these companies. And from an investment standpoint, there's still a lot of risk associated with this. So even though this is kind of may seem somewhat mundane in some sense, it's actually fairly important to understand that this is what's causing a lot of the volatility and, again, the sort of high risk assessment when you're looking at cannabis still. It doesn't really seem like it should be that risky to invest in cannabis when the demand is so high in a lot of these markets. Again, when you're looking at overall sales in New Jersey, there's nothing really negative there to be looking at. It looks like growth is expected. Growth is going to continue at a pretty sustained rate, and that sales and demand are high. But, like I said, then there's these other factors to consider. There's still the lack of banking access. There's still the difficulty when it comes to accessing capital. And a lot of other really small problems that can show up out of nowhere. And as soon as there's any issues with compliance from any of these companies, that can be a huge factor with them. Not that any of them are even trying to cause these issues, but again, just because of the vague and sort of confusing legal landscape, especially when you're looking at the U.S., when it's a state-by-state case, these issues can show up, and they can dramatically impact the stock price of these companies. They can dramatically impact the public perception of these companies, and unfortunately, as we've seen with almost everything in life these days, is once you get a certain media perception of your business, it's hard sometimes to backpedal, even if you are vindicated. So at least for Curaleaf in this situation, again, wasn't really a huge impacting issue, but it is something that did, again, negatively impact the company. And hopefully you'll see a little bit of a rebound for them. And again, I think that this will also add to the overall framework when you're looking at the industry as a whole in the U.S. This is a good example of what causes the skepticism, and is also something that you can see isn't as heavily impacting as it might be perceived as initially. Now, in other recent news, and speaking of how local municipalities can dramatically affect the industry, Ontario's largest city, which had banned retail cannabis stores up until this point, voted on Wednesday this week to opt in. Mississauga, Ontario was one of dozens of municipalities to ban retail cannabis stores from their communities when cannabis legislation came into effect in 2018 in Canada, and the City Council voted Wednesday an 8-4 to opt in. Mayor Bonnie Crombie spoke in favor, saying that she had supported opting out in 2018, hoping that the province would give municipalities greater control over locations of stores. The Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario is responsible for issuing licenses, and in municipalities to have opted in, one of the only restrictions on location is that stores must be at least 150 meters away from a school. And now, after 5 years, it's clear that the province will not be granting any additional oversight powers to municipalities, Crombie said. I've watched and observed the experience in other municipalities, and it does seem to sort itself out, she said. There hasn't been the clustering that we've been concerned about, and all I've observed over the past 5 years is the proliferation of illegal stores, and I don't want to see that here. We can't close them down. We don't have the ability to close them down, and if we're going to have product for sale in Mississauga, let's make it safe product, for goodness sake. Councillor Deepika Demerla put forward the motion, saying that opting out of the legal framework has allowed illegal stores to flourish in the city, including one in her ward that police have unsuccessfully tried 6 times to shut down. So the goal today here is not a choice between no stores and legal stores, she said. The choice today is between illegal stores, the profits of which are going to create more illegal activity, or legal stores. And according to the OCS, Mississauga continues to be disproportionately served by the illegal market compared to communities that have opted in, the Mississauga staff report says. And in a statement, representatives from the OCS said that they support Mississauga's decision to lift the ban, saying that the choice marks a major step forward as the cannabis industry continues to evolve within the legal framework. So, this will be a good thing for basically Ontario cannabis retail. I'm sure you're going to see a lot of announcements over the next couple of months of different retail brands getting their licenses, beginning to look at opening stores. And I wouldn't expect that there will really be any sort of negative backlash within the Mississauga community. Again, this will hopefully create the right type of competition to push out some of the illegal stores that are there. And this is something we've heard over and over again. Again, California is kind of one of the most prime examples of this, is if you do not support the legal industry once you've changed legislation, you're almost guaranteeing that you're going to have illicit stores operating in that same area. And, you know, those illicit stores, I will say a lot of the skepticism around them and a lot of the sort of PR campaigns against these illicit stores is often that, they're selling unsafe product. Most of the time, that isn't actually the reality there. The biggest issue really is that they're not paying into the tax system in any sort of meaningful way, and that they're basically hampering the legal industry. Those are pretty valid complaints against this. Obviously, we do want these legal industry businesses to succeed. I think people would also like an option where there are legacy businesses that can easily then jump into the legal market. We've seen that be kind of unsuccessful in most legal markets around the world. Again, there are different policies in place to allow legacy growers and legacy sort of talent to eventually enter into the legal market, but a lot of the time there's just a few too many sort of legal restrictions to allow most of them in, and a lot of them aren't interested in it, and that kind of is something I'll be talking about at the end of the podcast today when we're talking about the very holiday itself, 420. But realistically here, this kind of shows another example of, even again in Canada where it's federally legal, there still can be local communities that decide to ban cannabis retail. Again, a lot of their reasons aren't really based off of any sort of factual realities. You know, they're saying, oh, we're worried about a bunch of cannabis stores near schools. There's not a lot of cannabis businesses that would want to be near schools. That's not really what they want to deal with. That's going to be problematic for them as a business when they're having kids and high schoolers hanging around their business all day. That's a really quick way for their business to get shut down, or for them to find themselves in some sort of violation, or to have all the negative press that they're very heavily trying to avoid. And the same thing with worrying about clustering and all these things is, it turns out these businesses are competing with each other. So they don't want to have a clustered zone. They don't want to all be in the same area because it just creates oversaturation within that area. It diminishes all of their sales. It diminishes all of their uniqueness. And really within the Canadian retail market, there's not a lot you can do to really differentiate yourself from another retailer. You can obviously change the layout of your store. You can sell somewhat different product, but in general, you're all selling the same product roughly for the same price. The only thing you can really do is, like I said, aesthetics for how your store looks and then training of your staff. That's probably one of the most fundamental zones of competition within most retail markets now, is the training of the staff that are working there is going to be probably the biggest differentiator between the more successful cannabis retail outlet and the less successful one. As far as the product, again, they're all buying basically the same goods and they're all selling them essentially for the same price. You can lower it by very marginal amounts, but even then that becomes risky because you do have sort of certain margins that you have to stay within. So in the end, a lot of the concerns that any municipality has with bringing in cannabis retail just isn't really based on what is actually happening when you do open up legal cannabis retail within any market. You just don't see these problems occur. Everyone's worried about the crime rate increasing. Everyone's worried about, attracting a sort of a drug community, all these different things, when a lot of the time it just creates a very positive effect overall. And it gives people access to a product that they know is safe and regulated. I will say, again, that complaint doesn't really hold any water because, unfortunately, yes, there's been tons of legal product that hasn't passed tests multiple times in the Canadian market, in the US market. There's been a lot of different factors. Sometimes companies have been exposed to have been buying from the illicit market. But in reality, the big problem is you just want to support the legal market so that way, hopefully, a lot of these concerns about illicit and illegal activity just go away. And it's not because those companies are doing anything bad product-wise. A lot of the times, I've bought in many different illicit products. They're fantastic. And the quality of the bud that you're seeing in the gray market, if you want to call it that, or whatever you want to prefer to call it, really is actually sometimes above par from some of the product that you're seeing within the legal framework. And it'd be great if we could have all of the talent, again, just opt into the legal pool. It'd be great if the licensing fees, if the cost of operating your business, etc., was a lot lower, so you could have smaller operations enter into these same spaces. And I do think that that'll eventually happen. I just think that in every market, it's still, several years away. We're still in the infancy of this whole industry. So I don't think you're going to see any sort of meaningful change in how the overall system works anytime soon. But it's a good step forward for the Ontario cannabis market with Mississauga moving forward with this. And it does kind of, again, show, these types of issues that the cannabis industry is still dealing with. There still is tons of skepticism that's unwarranted. There still is tons of difficulties that they have to face when it comes to working with each municipality they enter into. They're just always being looked at under a microscope. And there's a real difficulty in running any business when you're constantly being scrutinized by the public, by the, rival businesses, by city councilors, by legislators, etc., the news. Everyone's just kind of looking at the whole industry under a microscope quite often. And it's difficult to continue operations as normal, and it's difficult to sort of maintain any normalcy in the industry with that kind of framework around them. But hopefully, eventually that changes. Now, in other positive news, UberEats is now offering cannabis deliveries in BC. Now, the tech company has partnered with cannabis company Leafly to offer the service, which became available on Tuesday, and the two companies have already been offering cannabis deliveries in Ontario since October of 2022. Those over 19 years of age will be able to place cannabis orders through the UberEats app and have them delivered by provincially certified staff. The app will now feature a recreational cannabis category and ask for age verification. More British Columbians are accessing legal cannabis than ever before, and we're partnering with industry leaders like Leafly to help retailers offer safe, convenient options for people in British Columbia to purchase legal cannabis for delivery directly to their homes. This will help reduce impaired driving and improve road safety, said Klaas Knierin, the General Manager of New Verticals for UberEats Canada. Now, over the last few years, we've invested heavily in our deliveries, offering and selection has expanded tremendously, and UberEats has grown quickly to become a versatile platform usable by diverse businesses, large and small. Cannabis deliveries in BC are not anything new, however, as home delivery for non-medical cannabis has been allowed in BC since July of 2021, and has also been available through the Canada Post since July of 2022. And there will be 13 cannabis stores in BC that will be available to deliver through UberEats at the start, and 10 of those dispensaries are located in Vancouver, along with 2 in Victoria and 1 in New Westminster. So overall, this is kind of a general positive thing for the consumers and the industry of BC. I will say the one negative side is that for many of the private retailers who are on the small to medium scale, a lot of them have already invested in having their own delivery drivers and having their own delivery platform because there was no other platform available. And so for a lot of them, this will be somewhat of a kick in the teeth. Again, most of them are kind of established in their delivery platforms already, so this isn't going to impact them that heavily, but eventually, I think in a lot of the markets, in a lot of the cities, in Vancouver or in BC, UberEats will be able to compete as far as scalability and price against, again, those individual delivery options. And so eventually a lot of these companies will probably have to get rid of their current delivery app system and also their current delivery drivers and delivery cars and eventually adopt UberEats. I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but unfortunately familiarity is a big factor when it comes to people doing any sort of thing when it comes to online or delivery options. People go with what they know a lot of the time. If there is one app that does it all, so you can order your food and your cannabis from the same thing, most people will choose that more convenient option than going to individual websites and ordering from specific retailers with their specific delivery programs. There will also probably be a difference in cost. UberEats will just be able to offer lower prices, especially on the delivery pricing and everything, just because they have a more scaled out business. So it's a good thing, I think, for the industry as a whole. It is going to be a tough thing for a lot of individual business owners who, again, have already invested in the infrastructure to basically do their own delivery platform. And some of those businesses may be able to kind of survive this and not really be impacted at all as long as they have sort of a robust enough framework. But I do think for a lot of them, this will be a little bit of an annoyance because they might have to then backpedal on things they've already developed and invested in. And that's some of the problems that, again, when you're looking at delivery and sort of the other infrastructure aspects of the cannabis industry, we're slowly seeing larger companies that maybe weren't willing to be attached to the cannabis industry in the past start to have these business connections. That is a good thing overall when it comes to the public perception, when it comes to how the industry evolves in general. But again, each time what you see is that the problem becomes a little more of a big issue when you look at what retailers or what these businesses had to do in the past before there was the adoption by these companies. So again, pre-UberEats offering this in BC, these companies had to create or work with a different delivery platform and a different delivery system. And so unfortunately, you can't unspend the money or undo the time you've invested into that. And even though now you could simply adopt the UberEats program, or you could even maybe work with both options, it still means that that previous investment maybe wasn't as valuable. And again, for some of these small and medium-sized businesses, sometimes that's not an investment that they can just kind of walk away from. And for some of them as well, this could be a bigger problem when some of their chain competitors can then beat out smaller locally owned businesses. And in general, this is, still being a big issue is as you see this industry evolve, there's, the overall success of the industry image, and then there's the more local and micro success of the industry, which often suffers when you're looking at sort of micro cultivators, when you're looking at small to medium business owners. A lot of them often are the biggest victims of any changes in the industry, just because, again, they can't always suffer the losses or be able to pay the steep fees to adopt into whatever new program shows up. So a generally good thing, but again, I do know some businesses will be a little bit pissed about that announcement. So lastly today, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about today, which is 420. And obviously, I think this has now become something that the general public is much more aware of as far as the understanding of what this sort of day is about when you're looking at sort of the protest movement side of it. I think a lot of that has disappeared. Now it's just basically a cannabis sales day. And I do wonder when it will just become basically a Black Friday or Boxing Day type of event. Similarly, where if you look at those holidays, they actually do have some sort of meaningful origin story behind them. But now it's just become a day for sales mania. And even the fact that over years we've seen the sales move away from being just that one day to maybe the day before and the day after to then basically the full week. Black Friday now is essentially almost a week-long sale. Same with Boxing Day. It's more about a Boxing Week sale. And I think that eventually, as you see more and more adoption of cannabis use and sort of the scaling out of recreational cannabis in different markets, eventually 420 will probably be a similar thing, where you might have a week-long event of 420 sales. I know lots of different businesses were promoting those types of things, where they were having sales leading up to 420, and then their biggest sale was on the day. Because 420 falls on a Thursday this year, I know lots of businesses just did the full week-long sale. Some of them as well are also extending it into tomorrow and the weekend. There's a lot of different versions of sort of offers and promotions that you're seeing. There's a store in Edmonton that's rolling the world's biggest joint supposedly today. And there's a bunch of different sort of events and promos. But what we've seen overall is that we're moving away from sort of the protest movement, holiday that this started as, into more of just a sales aspect holiday. Similar to what we see with almost everything in North America. When you're looking at kind of what's a fundamental difference between a North American holiday and holidays everywhere else in the world, is North American holidays are almost specifically devoted to capitalist retail. Whether you're looking at Christmas or Easter or Valentine's Day, realistically, even those, religious-based holidays have no real religious foundation that is celebrated or supported in most communities anymore. You don't see a lot of Jesus imagery when you're, dealing with Easter or Christmas. You see a lot of Santa and the Easter Bunny. So as we've seen with other holidays, a lot of this day now is much more focused on the consumer aspect. Again, Easter, Christmas, they're much more focused on candy, food, and alcohol sales than they are on any of the religious aspects of those holidays. And that's kind of the North Americanization of any holiday or any day that's celebrated realistically. And 420, it seems, is no different now. So I think that a lot of the protest and counterculture, origins of this day have mostly dissipated, and now it's just a sales day or a day for people to get high, which in general I do think is a good thing. I think societally it'd be great if everybody got high one day a year. We'd have a much more relaxed society. We'd have much more stress in the general environment. And I think it'd be a much better world to be a part of. So hopefully that is what everyone's doing for 420 today, is just everyone everywhere is getting high. That'd be an awesome idea to think about. But I do think that over time what you're going to see is more of the cultural aspect of 420 disappear and more of the sales and sort of commercial aspect of 420 continue to grow. It'll be interesting to see how this gets sort of rebranded and redeveloped over time. Because as many people have pointed out, there's still tons of people in jail. There's still tons of issues when it comes to the original activists who are supporting this industry, not really getting their credit and continuing to suffer for sort of the legal system of the past. And if people were really in support of 420, if people were really hoping for, let's celebrate that everything's legal now, you'd also be hoping to celebrate the fact that a bunch of these people would be getting out of jail, would have their criminal records expunged, etc., etc., but you're never really seeing that. And I think that over time, it becomes a little bit more difficult to stomach in some sense that you do have people who are still incarcerated while other people are celebrating sales around that very sort of day that's the discussion. The original discussion was about, sort of the legal environment and counterculture and sort of protest culture. So it's interesting to see that as cannabis continues to develop, and I've talked about this many times before, is how cannabis culture has shifted over time. and seeing that as it continues to be adopted by more people, which I think is generally a good thing, because we do want more people to have access to this. We do want people to have access to it both recreationally and medically, and we do want the stigma to disappear. But as the stigma disappears, so does a lot of the cultural aspects. And we start to see this become no different really than any other product that's out on the market. It does become the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry or the Pepsi industry. It just looks very homogenized and sort of generic. And unfortunately, you lose a lot of the sort of flavor and culture that built this industry to begin with. I think there's a lot of people fighting very heavily to try to keep some of that culture alive. But I think in general, it's a losing battle over time. And we'll see 420 turn into Boxing Day and Black Friday in a number of years, and a lot of the original intention behind this and even the focus on incarcerated sort of victims of past legalization or past legal frameworks will be mostly forgotten. And it's a sad thing to see, but again, you have to sort of pick your poison here of, do you want this industry to be expanded and do you want the social stigma surrounding cannabis to disappear, or do you want to hang on to the cultural aspect of it? And obviously I think it'd be great if you could have both, but unfortunately the world often doesn't work that way. So definitely something to think about today as you're getting high, hopefully, and enjoying 420 properly. That's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.